Thanks, Jonathan, for that introduction. You always make me sound more distinguished than I deserve. Thanks to you all for being here, and thanks to Boaz and Stevie and the entire ICT team for making today's conference possible. It's a great pleasure to be here in person, no less. It's actually my first time back in Israel since the pandemic, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Now, the last time I was here at this conference, I announced bounties in the amount of $15 million on the heads of terrorists in Syria. I'm a private citizen, so I can't do that anymore, but maybe you could check with my friend and successor, Tim Betts, and see if he's got anything up his sleeves. I'm here to talk about the Islamic Republic of Iran, in particular, its use of terrorism as a basic tool of statecraft, and what should be done about that. It might be tempting to think about the various problems presented by the Islamic Republic as separate and distinct. Here's the silo for the nuclear program, here's the human rights concerns, here's the drones being sold to Russia to wage aggressive warfare in Ukraine, here's terrorism, and here's something else. I want to suggest that this way of thinking about Iran is a mistake, indeed a profound mistake. All of these malign behaviors are related to one another because they all stem from the rotten core that is the Iranian regime. Addressing one aspect of the problem over here is inevitably going to have major consequences over there. For that reason, we need a comprehensive and integrated approach to deal with the full range of Tehran's problematic behaviors. Let me put this in practical terms. We can't simply compartmentalize the nuclear program and try to solve it in isolation. We have to consider how a new nuclear deal will enable other forms of Iranian misconduct. We have to be mindful that sanctions relief, billions and billions of dollars of sanctions relief, is going to dramatically increase Tehran's ability to violate human rights at home and to foment terrorism abroad. Make no mistake, the Islamic Republic of Iran is the world's worst state sponsor of terrorism. Acting through the Revolutionary Guards and countless terrorist proxies, the regime has murdered innocent civilians, taken countless hostages, and shed blood on a hideous scale, not just in the Middle East, but around the world. Why? Because ultimately, the Islamic Republic is a revolutionary regime. It seeks to consolidate and export the revolution, and terrorism is one of its main tools for doing so. If you think you're on a divine mission, then the laws against murder and extortion simply don't apply to you. Israel knows this threat all too well, but more and more, the United States also finds itself squarely in Tehran's crosshairs. Now, this audience doesn't need to be reminded of the shared threat our two countries face, but we've got 15 minutes to kill, so let's take a brief tour. Iran is encircling Israel, using a range of terrorist proxies to pressure this country on a number of fronts. To the north, in Lebanon, Iran has spent decades lavishly bankrolling the terrorist group Hezbollah, building a corrupt state within a state that serves Tehran's interests and impoverishes the Lebanese people. Hezbollah now sits on a massive arsenal of 100,000 rockets, and it's developing the capability to build its own precision-guided munitions. Hezbollah isn't just a threat to the state of Israel, it's also a threat to Israelis and Jews around the world. Indeed, this group is Iran's most dangerous and deadly terror proxy, plotting attacks in such far-flung places as Argentina, Bulgaria, and Cyprus. In the past few years, Hezbollah has been caught stockpiling explosives in Western Europe, in the Gulf, in Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. In the northeast, in Syria, the Revolutionary Guards are hard at work propping up the brutal Assad dictatorship and greatly adding to the misery of the long-suffering Syrian people. Hezbollah fighters are there too, of course. In the south, in Gaza, Iran-backed Hamas runs a terrorist statelet whose top priority is not providing basic services to the Palestinian people, but spending enormous sums trying to kill innocent Israelis, tunnels, rockets, even incendiary kites and balloons. Hamas's neighbors and rivals in Gaza, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, are also on Tehran's payroll. Farther afield in Yemen, the Iranian regime provides the Houthis with precision weapons they use to attack airports, energy infrastructure, and other civilian targets across the region, all the while bringing the Yemeni people to the brink of famine. Lately, we're seeing troubling signs that the Houthis might start targeting Israel. Nor is the United States immune to the Iranian threat. Right now, as we speak, the Islamic Republic is actively plotting to assassinate a number of former senior U.S. officials on American soil. Last month, our Justice Department announced charges against an IRGC member who allegedly was the ringleader of a plot to assassinate John Bolton, the former National Security Advisor. He also reportedly was targeting former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. These two men and others like them live under constant 24-hour government protection because of the Iranian threat to their lives. Meanwhile, in July, Tehran sent a gunman armed with an AK-47 to the Brooklyn home of Masih Alinejad, an Iranian dissident. This attempt on her life came on the heels of a plot in 2021 to kidnap her in New York and render her back to Iran to face torture or death. In August, an IRGC supporter tried to assassinate acclaimed author Salman Rushdie at a book festival in New York State, stabbing him multiple times on stage. Rushdie was set to speak on the subject of, get this, America's role as, quote, an asylum for writers and other artists in exile, and as a home for freedom of creative expression. It doesn't matter if Tehran didn't formally task the assailant with the attack. The regime put a multi-million-dollar bounty on Rushdie's head, which it reaffirmed and even increased as recently as 2016, so it bears responsibility. Looking farther back, in the past 3 years, the FBI has arrested and the Justice Department has prosecuted 3 Hezbollah operatives inside the United States. 2 of them were casing potential targets in New York City, including the Statue of Liberty and Rockefeller Center. Another had conducted surveillance on the Panama Canal. I want to repeat, this is all happening on American soil. It's also happening against the backdrop of talks in Vienna to entice Iran back into a nuclear deal. Now, one might have thought that Tehran would be on its best behavior while negotiations were underway, to build goodwill and demonstrate that it's a reliable interlocutor. Not so much. For that matter, one also might have expected the United States to walk away from the table as long as the Islamic Republic is actively attempting to murder Americans on American soil. If you want a deal, one can imagine Washington saying, maybe cool it with the assassinations. Again, not so much. We've talked about the threat to Israel and to the United States, but it's important to remember that the first victims of the Iranian regime are the Iranian people themselves. For decades, the Revolutionary Guards have looted the Iranian economy, corruptly enriching themselves at the people's expense. The regime's henchmen gunned down peaceful protesters in the streets. Its torture chambers brutalize ordinary Iranians for exercising their fundamental rights to free expression and free assembly. And now the regime has doubled down on its crimes against humanity. It used a sham election last year to install a butcher as president, Ebrahim Raisi, a man whose hands are stained with the blood of thousands of his countrymen. In 2019, we sanctioned him for his decades of appalling human rights violations, including his role in the 1988 death commission that slaughtered countless political prisoners. This is the president of Iran. Raisi is now set to address the United Nations next week in New York, the same place where his operatives are running any number of active terrorist plots. So what can we do about all this? Well, we can start by denying Raisi a U.S. visa. There's no reason to welcome a sanctioned human rights violator to the UN lectern as though he were the normal leader of a normal state. He's not, and it's not. As for the bigger question, I think that any policy towards the Islamic Republic has to begin with a simple principle. First, do no harm. What that means is, at a minimum, don't hand the regime the resources it will use to support terrorism around the world. Don't hand the regime resources it will use to further entrench itself at home and violently suppress those who are peacefully calling for change. We know that terrorism sanctions work. Sanctions deny terrorists the resources they need to plot attacks. Consider the example of Hezbollah. Since 2017, more than a dozen countries around the world have joined the United States in sanctioning or banning Hezbollah in its entirety, rejecting the fantasy that the group has a peaceful political wing that we can do business with. For years, Hezbollah could count on its patrons in Tehran to provide it with upwards of $700 million a year. But after we turned up the heat, the money dried up. Hassan Nasrallah was reduced to going on TV asking for donations. In 2019, the United States imposed terrorism sanctions on the Revolutionary Guards. And let me just say, on a personal note, the day we put the IRGC on the FTO list was one of the proudest moments of my time at the State Department. These sanctions make the Guards radioactive. They make it risky for any legitimate firm around the world to do business with them, hitting them where it hurts the most, in the wallet. Were the sanctions effective? Well, ask yourself this. Would the Guards be so desperate to get off the FTO list if it were merely symbolic? Remember, the point of sanctions is to change behavior. Until Tehran changes its behavior, those sanctions need to stay in place. And let's be clear, it's not enough to simply leave them on the books as a formal matter. The sanctions need to be enforced vigorously. Let me end where I began. We can't afford to put the Islamic Republic's nuclear ambitions, its support for terrorism, and its human rights abuses in separate analytical boxes. They're all interrelated. At the most basic level, offering billions in sanctions relief today squanders the leverage that might be used to press Tehran on terrorism, on ballistic missiles, and other issues tomorrow. Even worse, the regime stands to reap an enormous windfall that it certainly will use to shed more blood. More Israeli blood, more American blood. We will effectively be subsidizing terrorism against our own people. That's why, in my view, it's a mistake to say that a new nuclear deal would make war less likely. I want to suggest that it would make war more likely. Iran is already at war with us, and it would use its sanctions relief windfall to wage that war even more aggressively. We have the means to stop that from happening. The question is whether we have the will. Thank you all.